The following program does not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the City of Oceanside, its elected officials, KOCT, its board of directors, or staff.
You're watching KOCT, the Oceanside Channel.
Good evening and welcome to Editors to Journalists Roundtable here on KOCT. I'm your host, Alison St. John, and tonight we're going to have an opportunity to meet our elected Assemblywoman who's going to give us a bit of an insight into what's going on in Sacramento. We're also going to be talking a bit about public safety issues here in Oceanside and the gang problems and what's being done to deal with those. And then thirdly, we'll be talking a bit about a health-related issue, and we have community clinics who are really setting the pace in terms of digitizing their information and improving public health here. So stay with us, should be an interesting hour. And of course, our editor-journalist, we have the editor of the North County Times, Kent Davey, who is here, and Logan Jenkins, columnist from the San Diego Union Tribune. So gentlemen, have at it. Our first guest is our Assemblywoman, Diane Harkey, from the 73rd District, who was elected in 2008 and is now grappling along with everybody else with this state budget. Kent, would you like to start?
Assemblywoman, I know that you are considered something of a Republican expert on state budget matters. Today's the 1st of July, and there is a constitutional requirement that the legislature should have delivered up a budget at this point, and it's nowhere near in sight. Can you tell us when or what it's going to take to break it loose, and when we might expect a budget?
Well, here's the thing about a budget. Most cities, local municipalities have to have them on time, and they do. They report them, and the staff gets them done. They have scheduled them out, and then they come back on a consensus on a calendar item. In the state, it's up to the majority party who makes the rules and sets the agenda. They have to determine when the hearings take place or when the bills are presented and in what form. So the budget was presented, the governor presented his budget. Now we are waiting for Mr. Steinberg, President Pro Tem of the Senate, and John Perez, who is our new Speaker of the House, to come together on what they think it should be, because they disagree with the governor's budget, and then to bring us all in and kind of get us to vote. But that has to be scheduled by the majority party. So while we would like not to wait, and we're not exactly sitting around waiting, we're coming up with ideas and line items that, you know, might be more palatable, because, you know, we support a lot of the governor's budget. There's some items where we will have a little problem with too, but right now that's the only thing on the table.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us anything at all about the differences between the Democratic Assembly version of their plan and the Democratic Senate version, because there's some big gaps between the two of those?
Right. Well, the Assembly version is really a non-starter because it relies on borrowing that won't happen. So that being said, I haven't given it a lot of thought or really a lot of study, because when you think that the majority of the budget is really not doable, by the Attorney General has cast an opinion that it's not doable, and the Treasurer cannot issue a bond without a clean opinion from the AG, so it's really a non-starter. Mr. Steinberg has a lot of items that he's doing like a 5-year workout plan, which incidentally we need to be doing, but his agenda or ideas are basically transferring a lot down to the locals. However, not really cutting anything from the state, giving them some money and to start it out, but it's really not cutting the state mandate, so or even the funding to the state. A little bit is going down to the locals, but in the final analysis, the locals will end up having to pick up a big bulk of what's being transferred down to them, and we would oppose that. I mean, we need to reduce the impacts of state government. And if, in fact, we bring things more locally, which we need to do because we've gotten way too top-heavy in the state, and the state's like a nation. I mean, it's a nation state. Southern California, Northern California, Central Valley, even counties, vast differences, but there's a huge difference between what Northern California, their lifestyle, their needs and wants, and Southern California. So even in that, it makes it very different. So I'm all for divesting some of that authority down to the local level, but I'm also for reducing the top-heavy management from the state level.
Assemblywoman, can you explain how Republicans are going to gain leverage as the budget process goes forward? What mechanisms can they use to exercise their influence, and where do you think they absolutely have to go? What are the sort of absolute issues that they'll go to war for?
Well, the governor has already said he's not going to increase taxes, and I quite honestly think with the populace feeling the way that it does, all of the polling up and down, I mean, Republican, Democrat alike, they're not going to go for another tax increase, and that's another thing the Democrat budget, at least on the House side, for sure calls for a tax increase in several areas. Categorical that supposedly won't harm everybody, but in essence it will. And so we won't go there. If for some reason they manage to cull off some votes to get to the 54, I think we're all in trouble up and down the state, because I think the state spending has doubled from 1998 to 2008. So it's not that we didn't have enough revenue. We just overspent, and we created too many more programs. And the problem with is once you create a program, it's very difficult to take it back or to cut it back. And so it's not really a taxation and spending are an issue. It's more of a spending issue. We really have to rein it in. But we are fundamentally bankrupt, and that's the point that's not being made. If we just had a budget, we would bring our expenses up to our revenues, down to our revenues, and we could manage that. You can do that. That's what cities have to do on a regular basis. We have not done that. We have plugged the hole for the last at least 10 years, probably more like 15. And we have an extremely large structural deficit. By 2009, I estimate it was $35 billion, and we had an $84 or $82 billion general fund at that time. And the Department of Finance or Department of Treasury issues a debt affordability report, and that states that we're going to add probably another $30 billion onto that over the next couple of years. So we're in this big spiral. And you can't cut nor tax $20 billion a year for the next 5 years when you're starting with $84 billion. That's not rocket science. You know that in your house. People know that in their business. So we have to restructure state government. That's the only way we're going to get out of this. We can't keep cutting, and we can't keep taxing. We have to make some reductions. We definitely have to. But we have to reduce some of the functions of the state government. And we have to also try to generate revenues, which at this point would come from employment, because the state of California is one of the leading nations, or one of the leading states, I call ours the nation state. We are a nation, for unemployment right now. And that it's ridiculous. If you look at a map of the state, it's just the gray areas are 13% and over. If you look at the employment development map, and it nearly covers the state in gray to black, and we can't survive that way.
In the early 90s, Pete Wilson, when he was governor, fairly famously said, "California is a job-killing machine." Is it still a job-killing machine?
Unfortunately, it is, and let me tell you what is killing it. More than anything, we've talked to businesses up and down the state, and I watch bill after bill after bill come through the Assembly. It's regulatory environment. The regulatory environment is strangling the state. That is a tax that we don't see on our paycheck or a pay stub, or you don't pay it in your sales tax, but you are paying for it. And businesses are getting crushed in the regulatory environment. And so that's what's driving them out of the state, I think, more than the taxation. Everyone we've talked to, the taxation, everybody loves California. All Californians, we seem just love it here. I mean, I just love the state, and I think most people do. But when they get, and so they're willing to pay a little tax, but the regulatory environment over the last few years has been so draconian, and with less businesses, the regulators have, we've actually increased regulatory requirements as well as regulators. We've hired more. And so with fewer businesses to monitor, they're getting hit more frequently with more. And it's killing us. It really is killing us right now. Quite honestly, if we were to close Washington, D.C. down, send everybody home, and close Sacramento down, send everybody home, we'd probably get out of this a lot faster than what we're doing now.
When you talk about structural reform of state government, what is, in practical terms, that people out in our audience can understand? What is it you're talking about? What would you do?
Okay, first, you've heard time and time again about this rainy day fund. We really do have to have it. And I know we can't afford it now, but let's assume when our revenues get to the $90 billion mark again, like they will, we know that they will, then everything over and above that should go to a reserve to reduce debt because we're in way over our head. The reason we're in a problem right now is we can't borrow anymore. That's why we're in this, we just can't borrow. The credit market will not loan to us. And so we have to reduce debt and then set money aside because we peak and then we crash. And you can see this every 10 years. And it's not rocket science when you have most of your revenue now is no longer like the 1960s and 70s. We had a large sales tax revenue. Right now it's mostly personal income tax. So personal income tax, capital gains. When people are making money, the state is making money. When people, when we have a recession, it falls off, and then the income to the state falls off. So very dramatically.
Right. Does that imply that you are interested in pursuing things that would change that fundamental structure of the income tax, the state income tax?
Well, if I believed that we were interested in actually either staying tax neutral or reducing tax, I might go there. The problem is all the ideas that I've seen have ultimately increased the tax on people, and that's not where I'm willing to go. Like I said at the very beginning, it's not a revenue problem that we've had. We've spent too much and we haven't set anything aside. So the reserve fund's very important. Reducing debt is going to be very, very important. We also have to streamline some of our government functions, as I've said, probably do an across the board because we can't seem to come to any other agreement. I don't want to tell any of the departments how to run their department. I can't micromanage them. But right now, I have had employees come in to me from various departments, and I will say, okay, because they didn't like the furloughs. And I'd say, okay, well, if we reduced your staff or your department budget by 10 to 15%, would you know where to save the money? And they all say yes, because we're on this kind of budgeting where you have to spend it all or you lose it. So they can have $300 million sitting around. They can't work and pay it in salaries, but they have to spend it. So they waste it on something because otherwise they won't get it again the next year. So we need to change the way we budget too. You know, we need to go to a more performance-based budgeting, get the employees involved. They know what to do.
Senator Weiland has suggested going to a 2-year budget cycle, basically budgeting 1 year, doing legislation the second year. Is that an idea that you support?
I would support it with one caveat that we're like I said, we are in the structural spiral of deficit. It's an undeclared bankruptcy, and so once we pull out of that, I think it would be great. But we did an 18-month budget last February, and we were back again in June. And I said in December when I first got sworn in December of 2008. That we had a budget meeting the very next day, a budget vote the very next day. And I said, you can't get out of this way. We are structurally bankrupt. You're going to be right back here again in less than 6 months. We were back again with another deficit in that February. And then in February, I said, you can't get out of this. You can't tax out of this. You can't really cut out of this. You're going to have to do some structural reforming because you're fundamentally bankrupt. And voila, there we were in June, trying to dig away out of another $20 billion. You can't keep cutting or digging out or taxing $20 billion. We really need to take we need to really come together and do a workout for California like you would if you were a business. Because if we don't do it, we're going to be, I mean, if our next governor doesn't have some street credibility and isn't able to craft something with some cooperation to get us back on track in some of the items that I've said, we will probably need a federal guarantee of debt. And we don't want to go there. We do not want to lose our sovereignty. If that happens, that's like the worst of all worlds, I think, for California. So we have to be serious about this and really, we can do it, and we can create revenues again, but we can't keep in this, we can't borrow anymore like we did in 2004.
The governor has signed pacts or deals now with 6 of the state's public service unions that at least start down a road of pension reform. I know you're on a subcommittee that has some oversight on pension reform. How far do you see this going?
Well, I am very, very pleased that the parties are coming to the table to negotiate contracts. I think that the public employees, I don't deal with the union representatives, but the public employees are very upset right now because they feel like their services and their jobs aren't appreciated. Because they seem to be the focus, and they really want to do well, and they want to come to the table, but there's always the unions need to do this for them, their representatives. So I'm really pleased that is coming forward. We need to do that. The agreement that we're operating under was negotiated in 1999 when we had a lot of extra money. And quite honestly, that agreement left the Senate on consent calendar. That means it didn't even come up for discussion. It probably went through committees, but it never reached the floor on discussion. So it was a bipartisan, supposed to be great deal, but the devil was in the details. It was not sustainable, and it's not sustainable. One of the problems we've got in the next couple of years, we're going to 10% of our state budget general fund will be going to debt service, and another 5% to pension. We can't sustain that. You know, our debt service should be always like under 6. That's kind of the standard. And so when you're talking about 40% or more goes to the K through 14 education, and then 10 to 15% goes to debt, and then you've got public safety issues, you know, the criminal justice system. You know, you're running out of money really fast.
If you could drive the debate over the pensions for public employees, what fundamental reform would you make?
You know, there are so many, and they're making good efforts on them. One of the ones that it's really important. A lot of the reforms that have been taking place right now apply to future hires. We have some concession with existing hires, but that's part of the federal, I think it's a federal law, federal contract law. So we have to sustain that. I would like to see a little more effort made on the existing individuals' part, because the future hires is a great effort. And I think actually most of them are in fact contributing more to their pensions in the agreements that the governor struck. But we still need to get the bigger unions involved, the larger ones involved, because as their earnings fluctuate in their pensions, the state has to pick up the difference. So like this last year, CalPERS was going to ask, decided not to ask, and I heard was going to ask again for another $600 million to fund the pensions. Well, we can't pay for what we've got now, so there has to be something done there. So I'd like to see a little more effort done with the existing, but you know, that's...
In practical terms, though, how would the Assembly or the Senate, how would the legislature put pressure on the unions to sort of get more in tune with reality?
Well, you know, state and public employees, SEIU, they're all Californians. And to me, it's better to get something than a certain percent of nothing. And the state is truly spiraling down, and we have to get a handle on it. And I think everybody, when they're asked one-on-one or a group that will come in. They all understand where we are. They just don't want to be the first ones to step up. And I understand that. But you know who I've found to be the first ones to always step up has been the public safety guys, and I mean women. It just, they seem to be the first out of the chute every time. So I think we need to respect the efforts, but I think as we get moving along, the governor needs to negotiate the contracts, but as we get moving along and everybody understands the true problem that we're in, like I said, something is better than a huge percent of nothing. And that's a very important concept to remember, because we do have to dig out. And maybe some of these things can come back at a later date, or you can renegotiate later. I mean, I'm not sure, but we really need to get the employees and the unions involved. And since they are so powerful in this state, the teachers union, SEIU, we really have to get them to start taking a little more ownership in the longevity of the state.
You mentioned them being so powerful in this state, but is California ahead of the game in terms of pension reform for state employees? Has nobody else made more headway?
Well, the only states that I'm not versed on what's going on across the country as well as I am in California, because I'm so immersed in it. And I never thought I'd be doing pension reform, because that wasn't anything that I really understood anything about till I got into local government. And but I've got to tell you that I know that Illinois is in a deep hole, New Jersey's in a deep hole, and some of the more heavily unionized states are. So I think that while California's making some efforts, finally, maybe they can lead the way. And there's many things you can do. You know, I mean, the spiking has been taken care of, and then kind of not, you find out. The salary, basing the retirement on 3 years or on 1 year instead of 3 to 5 or 5 years, last 5 years. There's a lot of avenues we need to take. Also, maybe increasing the retirement age. I mean, if you're not doing, I would not want, let's say, a CHP or a policeman or even a fire worker, fireman, fire person, out climbing around and running around much after 55. I think that's a pretty tough physically and straining job. But, you know, people that work at the desk, people that do other things. I won't say how old I am, but I'm certainly not ready to retire. And I'm beyond the age that I could retire as a public employee. Another place where we have problems is where you retire and then you hire back in again, that double dipping syndrome. And that's just wrong. I mean, if you want to keep working, keep working. You know you've got your retirement out there. But to retire and then hire back in, I think is just fundamentally wrong. I think that's a huge problem.
In this last edition of Journalist Roundtable, we spoke with Carlsbad Mayor, and they've started doing some pretty innovative pension reform. And I'm wondering whether at the local level, the city level, maybe the reform might start there and trickle up rather than the other way around.
I think it does. You know, our locals have a lot of really good ideas because they have to balance their budget. They can't, the state takes money from them. They can't do the reverse. And the state has taken quite a bit of money from Oceanside, redevelopment funds, and as well as transportation dollars. So, I think that, Carlsbad has suffered as well. I know that my Orange County cities have. The county governments have all had money taken up to the state. Every time the state runs out of money, they seem to reach down to our locals who plan and set aside reserves and plan for their problems, and then all of a sudden you've got the state taking that away, and the state does not set aside or reserve or plan. So it's, there's a flaw there somewhere.
It's never set aside a reserve, the state?
No. We had some in the good days for a short while. But remember, we borrowed $15 billion in 2004 to plug the hole for the deficit, and we have added to that ever since.
One of the state's conundrums is that it has a prison system that has a lot of very expensive correctional officers with very, very nice pensions and not enough room for all of its inmates. So how do you solve that particular, I'm going two different directions at one time problem?
That's interesting. That's a very interesting scenario, because Before I was on the floor, before I got elected to the Assembly, there was a bill passed, and I think it was AB 900, Assembly Bill 900, that allowed for reform in the prison system and sentencing and whatnot, and we were supposed to also build more prison facilities. And the funding got stopped because of the crash. So we never did bond for the prison facilities. So that's a part of the equation. As far as I've heard, I'm not on the in a judicial or on anything to do with corrections. I'm not on any of those committees, but I have heard horror stories both ways. And it's true, there's a lot of, I think, things that we could do within the correctional officers' programs. There's ways that we could streamline. We've all heard about the cost per prisoner. And right now, though, they're under receivership, and it's the medical expenses that are just skyrocketing. We could save, I think it's over $1 billion if we could come to an agreement. If we had built the additional space like we were supposed to, we wouldn't have the receivership now. And the receivership expenses for medical care are costing us a fortune. And understand, too, when they transport somebody out, it takes 2 people to go with them to get the service, and then 2 to come back. And it's truly, there's some excesses on both ends there. But you find that a lot in state government. There's very little accountability, and I find I'm just kind of appalled with some of the things I see on some of the projects, the tracking. For instance, Caltrans comes in, and and they're just one. There's just one agency will come in and want to hire additional people for projects, and so normally you would be tracking the people to the projects, to the workload, and figure out where they need them. They'd have something for you to look at. There's nothing. They can give you a pie chart and show you kind of where, in color coded, how many projects they've got, what's on the table, what they expect to be coming up, and they just need these people because 5 years ago there was a study done and it said that they were going to add this many people to staff, and so now they need them. And so I mean it's just and look at the high-speed rail. We don't have investment grade analysis for this.
Expensive project to another. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I was just dying to ask you about one program. You mentioned at the beginning that we start up these new programs and then we can't afford them. But one program that's been going on for a long time, welfare, the governor has suggested cutting it all together. And just very briefly, I wondered what your feeling is about that.
I don't see it happening. I think, things are thrown out right now. It's an election year. The governor is terming out. People are playing to constituencies. And, it's always this big hard line in the sand. But the ultimate, in the end, we have to have 54 votes in our House, and they have to have 27 in the Senate in order to get anything done. And then the governor has to sign it. So it's going to be in the votes in the House is how this is all going to happen.
And in the last 30 seconds we have, what's your prediction of when the budget will pass this year?
It will be late, as it always has been. And if it's not passed sometime in the summer, I would bet you nothing happens till the next governor, and that's going to be pretty sad.
Hard to imagine how the state will stumble along for that long. But
well, I think they've stashed enough of borrowed cash and deferred payments probably to do that, but it's going to be pretty painful.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your insights into what is, as you say, a very painful process. Our Assemblywoman, Diane Harkey. And stay with us here on Journalists Roundtable on KOCT. We'll be right back to talk about the gang problem here in Oceanside.